was not easy for Betty DeVore. Her mother had been in and out of mental institutions ever since she could remember. Unfortunately, she and her siblings suffered physical and mental abuse at the hands of both her father and mother. On one occasion, her mother had even thrown a butcher's knife at her, which sounds absolutely horrifying. When Betty was 9 years old, she and her sister were both raped in a barn by a man that had worked with their father. When the man was done assaulting both young girls, he held up a large ball-peen hammer and threatened that if either of them ever said a word about the rape, he would smash both of their heads to a bloody pulp. Young Betty tucked the memory in the back of her mind and did her best to forget this ever happened, which I can only imagine is incredibly difficult to do. In her early teenage years, Betty's mother had a nervous breakdown and ended up being hospitalized. Her treatment for depression included 82 electric shock treatments. During her hospitalization, Betty witnessed her father having sex with a girlfriend that he had on the side, only adding to Betty's trauma, as you can imagine. When Betty was old enough to leave home, however, she met Dale Guffey, and the two were married. For a brief time after the birth of their second son, in 1969, Betty herself ended up being admitted to a mental hospital as well. Dale later recalled that Betty just hadn't been herself. He described it as her being someplace else. She would scream about random things, but he never quite knew what triggered her and upset her. During Betty and Dale's 18-year marriage, they had 4 children. Other than that period of time when Betty had been hospitalized, their marriage was actually good. There was nothing really that stood out of being overly traumatic or really anything bad. It sounds like they had a civil, respectable marriage. There was never any physical abuse between the two of them. However, after 18 years of marriage, it did run its course, and they ended up getting a divorce in the late 1980s. Their older boys stayed with their father, while their 11-year-old daughter, Heather, chose to live with Betty. Around 8 years later, in late February of 1988, Betty found herself single again and read a notice in the local paper about a meeting for singles in Fairfield. With a population of just under 10,000 people, Fairfield, Iowa was the largest city in the county. When she met 56-year-old Harold Freiberg, the large man towered at least a foot over her small frame. Harold, too, was recently single. He was a natural charmer, owned a farm in nearby Libertyville, and ran a business selling antique furniture from his home. Betty and Harold hit it off was listed as the beneficiary of each. Betty recalled that the first 2 years of marriage with Harold were wonderful. Her relationship with Harold was loving until something suddenly changed during the winter of 1990. There was a sudden snap. Whatever had attracted Harold to Betty was abruptly gone. From that point on, there was a steady pattern of abuse that brought Betty back to memories of her childhood. At this time, 2 of Harold's ex-wives were suing him for back alimony and child support that he had refused to pay over the past 10 years. Later, one of the bulls on the farm had died, which ended up causing problems. Everything that went wrong in Harold's life became misdirected anger toward Betty. That winter, the farmhouse had settled, causing a crack in one of the interior walls. For some reason, Harold saw that as Betty's fault too. He kicked her foot while wearing his work boots, fracturing her toe and requiring a trip to the hospital. From that point forward, he screamed and berated her in every possible scenario. The house wasn't clean, the meals weren't cooked to his liking, or the work on the farm wasn't done correctly. You name it, anything that went wrong, anything that Harold didn't see was done to his satisfaction, Betty became the emotional punching bag, and then, unfortunately, eventually the yelling turned into backhanded slaps across her face, or he would grab her arms and shake her violently. Everything that happened suddenly became Betty's fault, or Heather's. This daughter that he so proudly adopted just a year before was also a target of his abuse. He would call the 14-year-old stupid for minor mistakes like putting the wrong price tag on antique furniture or doing her chores incorrectly. She too endured slaps, whippings with his leather belt, and having her hair pulled. From Betty's perspective, I can't even imagine how devastating this was for her, knowing what she endured herself at the same age that Heather was, and how traumatizing that was for her to now see her own daughter go through it. On her 14th birthday, she lied to her friends to explain away the bruising and scratches on her face. In another instance, Harold stripped off Betty's clothes and rubbed foot powder inside of her vagina, yelling, "Maybe you can lose some weight from the inside," which is absolutely horrific, and clearly something incredibly wrong was going on inside of Harold's brain to even consider treating his wife and stepdaughter this way. Heather had witnessed the abuse of her mother on several occasions by her adoptive father. He had suddenly turned into a violent monster. As the months passed, the abuse escalated. Heather watched as he strangled Betty with an alarm clock cord he had just ripped out from the wall. On another occasion, Heather witnessed Harold throwing a 5-gallon bucket, hitting Betty in the back of the head. When Betty hadn't cooked a meal to his liking, he stabbed her in the arm. Every day came with the constant threat of violence for both Betty and Heather. The abuse seemed endless. Harold showed dominance over his wife by placing the cords of an electric fence charger on each side of her head injured her leg so badly that it required medical treatment and time in a wheelchair. It became an everyday occurrence for Harold to demean his wife with insults about her weight, calling her a fat cow. In September of 1991, Harold took Betty outside, threw her to the ground, and tore open her blouse. He then grabbed a bottle of farm chemicals, poured it on her belly, and rubbed it in violently. He would make comments like, "Maybe this will help you lose some weight," or "I'll burn some of this fat off of you," which is disgusting and is so emotionally abusive and traumatizing. As anybody would in this situation, Betty considered leaving him, but he threatened that if she ever did, he would hunt her down and kill both she and Heather. He said that he would make Betty watch as he cut off Heather's fingers joint by joint. And Betty took him seriously. She thought that this was a big possibility. She knew that Harold regularly carried a gun on his belt and often threatened to use it on her. He joked to a friend that he could chop up his wife and daughter and spread them all over the farm. So Betty really felt like she was out of options. With nowhere left to turn, she put a gun to her own head with the intent of killing herself, but Heather stopped her. Heather asked her, "What will happen to me if you do this?" Heather yelled at her mother for even thinking of leaving her alone with such a madman. Which, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine how Heather would feel in that situation. I understand why Betty would want to find a way out, but as the daughter, I'd be devastated and heartbroken to one, lose my mom, and to then be forced to be the one left behind with Harold. That September, Betty was at a loss for a way out of the dreadful situation. On top of that, she was having debilitating migraines. So Betty went to a doctor for this, saying that she'd get headaches that were so bad that she would black out from them on occasion. In the early morning hours of September 29th of 1991, Betty was yanked out of bed and dragged down the basement stairs. Harold was drunk and upset as usual, accidentally calling her Pat, the name of one of his ex-wives. Harold was leaving for an antique show in Des Moines, Iowa, the next day and demanded that Betty help him pack boxes for the trip. He had also misplaced his wallet and demanded that she find it for him, or she and Heather would be looking for it the whole next day if necessary. Annoyed that he pulled her out of bed, Betty refused to help him. She told him she was going back to bed and headed for the stairs. But before she could even reach the stairs, Harold pulled his gun out on her. Betty froze for a beat, then lunged for the nearby workbench that had two revolvers on it. They were a 22 and a 38 caliber. In a blink, she grabbed them both, cocked the hammers, pointed them both at Harold, closed her eyes, and fired twice with each gun. Harold mumbled, "Why did you go and do that?" as he fell to the ground. When Betty opened her eyes, her husband was there lying on the basement floor. All 4 shots hit Harold. 1 shot hit his neck. 2 shots punctured his heart and both lungs, and another hit his back. She knelt down next to her husband and wept while the blood drained out of him. Betty woke in a daze the next morning in her own bed. She was unsure what had happened the night before, initially thinking that it was just a bad dream. However, a quick look down the basement stairs reminded her that it was very real. She had to confront the fact that her husband was dead because of her own actions, and however, Betty closed the basement door and just went on about her day. After seeing Heather off to school that morning, Betty drove 100 miles north to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to take care of an insurance policy she had been working on. When she returned home that evening, she and Heather had dinner together and finished the day as if it were any other. The following day, after Heather left for school, Betty returned to the basement. Psychiatrists would later say that what happened over the next 6 hours was the result of a dissociative state and an effort by Betty to avenge a lifetime of physical and mental abuse, using several knives and an electric circular saw. She got to work. She had butchered deer before, so she knew what she needed to do here with Harold's body. Betty began mutilating and dismembering her husband, starting with his genitals. She cut off his penis and testicles and placed them into a plastic bag. Using the circular saw, she cut off both legs, first at the knees, then the hip. Without the weight of the legs, she dragged the body to the garage where she cut off the arms. Betty stripped the muscle and flesh from several of the limbs and cut the meat up into manageable bits. The heart, liver, and one lung were removed, and she treated this very much like she would an animal caught in the wild in a hunt. Using Heather's little red wagon, she piled the smaller parts of Harold's body onto the wagon and dragged it into the autumn sun, throwing body parts and chunks of meat haphazardly around the farm. The larger pieces she piled into the trunk of her car, drove down the county roads, and threw them on the side of the road randomly. That afternoon, Betty picked Heather up from school, and the two of them went to get their hair done. That evening, the two of them went out to dinner. Heather was entirely unaware of what Betty had done. 8 days go by, and Betty knew she couldn't wait forever. She would eventually have to report Harold missing and come up with a story. So on October 8th, she called the police to report him missing. She told police that he had left the farm on September 30th in a white van on his way to Illinois to take care of some antique business, but she hadn't heard from him since. When police came to the farm to ask questions about his disappearance, it didn't take long to realize that something sinister had happened. Near the gate of the farm, they found a knife and a leather belt with the initials HF branded on it. As they questioned Betty, Heather walked in during the conversation with some information. She had called her cats in to feed them, but when they didn't come, she went looking for them. Police were a little shocked when she said she found her cats in a strawberry patch nearby, eating a rotting piece of fleshy meat. A search team was brought to the Freiburg farm and scoured the property for the next 2 days. When they found a large bone and a shoe beneath netting used to cover hay, they knew that they had a murder on their hands. They also found a right arm, a torso, and random body parts all over the farm. Police gathered various knives, the power saw, 2 rifles, a revolver, the life insurance policies, a rug containing a bullet, a bloody bath towel, and a file folder containing Harold's previous divorce documents. days later, on October 10th, police ended up returning to arrest Betty for the murder. When she was confronted with the evidence against her, Betty quickly confessed to killing her husband, but pleaded that she was innocent. She said that the killing was in self-defense. She knew that if she hadn't shot, Harold would have killed her. That, of course, made sense. But what didn't make sense was why she dismembered and completely eviscerated his body, covered up the crime, and waited 8 days to report him missing. Prosecutors wanted a quick case and offered a plea bargain, but Betty refused it completely, knowing it would mean a guaranteed life sentence. The trial of 43-year-old Betty Frieberg drew significant media attention to this tiny little town in Iowa. If convicted, she would face life in prison. Betty had been charged with Harold's murder, but not the mutilation of a corpse or concealing a crime. Because of this, her attorney reminded the jury that they were only there to determine if she had acted in self-defense. They were to take into consideration that she had butchered his corpse after death or lied to police about his disappearance. The prosecution had tried to establish premeditation and argued that Betty had planned this murder. They pointed out that there were 3 life insurance policies totaling $250,000, of which she was the beneficiary. However, a representative from the life insurance company testified that Betty would have known that if she caused a person's death, the policy wouldn't be paid. Prosecutors explained to the jury that they agreed Harold was a chronic abuser, but despite the domestic abuse, Betty was not in a position to issue a death sentence to her husband for his crime. Betty's lawyer, Tom Walter, was an eccentric 6'7" attorney that wore cowboy boots with his suit and carried a pink-haired troll doll with him to trial each day. He explained to the media that it was given to him by his 15-year-old daughter for good luck. Ironically, Walter had represented Harold during one of his 4 divorces. Although he was from the small rural area, he was well known in the state for arguing before the Iowa Supreme Court in a case that resulted in the state's sodomy laws being declared unconstitutional. Walter called each of Harold's 4 ex-wives to the stand to testify about their abuse at the hands of Harold. But each time the testimony was met with an objection by the prosecution. The wives were not allowed to testify, but it seemed as though the jury got the point. Walter told the court that it wasn't a case of battered wife syndrome, but strictly a case of self-defense. Betty had killed her husband to avoid being killed herself. Heather took the witness stand to describe her own abuses by Harold and the abuses she witnessed her mother receiving. Even a woman that was a customer buying antique furniture testified that she felt sorry for Betty when she came to their home. Harold had openly flirted with this woman in a crude way while berating Betty in front of her. A psychiatrist that saw Betty shortly after the killing testified that he believed Betty was in a dissociative state when she dismembered her husband and was avenging her previous abuse. He hypothesized that when she cut off Harold's penis, she was specifically avenging the rapes she had endured as a child. He also believed that she dispensed of his body parts throughout the farm because Harold had said he would do the exact same thing to her. The prosecution pointed out that the medical examiner determined that the first gunshot was to Harold's back, meaning that he couldn't have been pointing a gun at her. They also told the jury that no fingerprints were found on the gun that Betty claimed Harold had pointed at her, and it also wasn't loaded. But none of that seemed to matter. The jury believed her, and Betty Frieberg was acquitted of murdering her husband, Harold. After the trial, she spoke with the media, clutching her lawyer's lucky troll doll, and said, "If I had known the gun he was holding was unloaded, we'd still be together. I still love him. I so much for watching this video,